Hey there, it's Andre, the Impulsive Thinker. Today I have back Dr. Gurdeep Parhar, who's the medical director at the Adult ADHD Center in British Columbia, Canada. You recognize him as he's been on here to discuss ADHD medication and how to talk to your doctor about ADHD. Dr. Gurdeep, how are you today? And thank you for coming back again.
Great. Thanks for having me, Andre. I'm doing well. Thank you.
Um, Today you're here. We're going to talk about ADHD and depression because this is 2023. It's ADHD Awareness Month, October, and I'm doing a little bit of a focus on mental health. And I wanted the listeners to start um, looking at depression and mental health from a different lens, how ADHD and depression coexist. And I think that's one of your terms you like to use, right? Coexist rather than comorbidity.
Yeah, we're trying to move away from, the term morbid. It just has so much negative connotations. And frankly, these conditions do exist with one another. So the coexisting is just a gentler term. And I think it really does emphasize that, morbidity, yes, means disease, but we're actually looking at conditions that exist with one another.
Okay. So how about we start off, but can you define clinical depression or what is depression?
Great question, Andre. So when we talk about depression, I think everyone has probably felt a bit sad or felt a bit down and thought to themselves, am I depressed? But when we talk about clinical depression, which is a diagnosis that's supported by our DSM or diagnostic manual, and in it you have to have certain criteria of symptoms that have to be present for at least 2 weeks, and at least five of these symptoms. And I'll sort of list them off. The first one, and it's probably the most obvious, is depressed mood. That most of the day, nearly every day, someone feels sad, they feel empty, they feel hopeless, they're feeling down, right? The second symptom potentially is loss of interest or pleasure. So if there are things that you normally want to do and that really excites you, whether it's a hobby or meeting up with friends or watching a television program, a certain type of exercise, that you're just not interested in it anymore. Weight loss or weight gain. So a lot of times people often think about, I'm gaining weight, it's because I'm depressed. Well, it could be, and it could be that you're eating more and you're less active, but it could also be that depression can also be if you've lost weight, you have a decreased interest in eating and decreased appetite. Sleep changes. So we often think about people who are depressed sleeping less because they have a hard time falling asleep or waking up a little bit earlier in the morning. But actually, when you're depressed, you can actually sleep more. There's often this feeling that you just don't want to get out of bed, that you just want to just keep sleeping and hide under your quilt or your comforter. Psychomotor agitation. And what we're talking about there is that you feel restless, you feel a bit agitated, you just can't calm down. Decreased energy. So just having that sort of no energy, fatigue all the time, not wanting to do anything. Feeling worthless or having what we call inappropriate guilt. And what we mean by that is just feeling down about yourself. Things aren't going well and it's my fault, right? Things haven't gone well and I wish I could have done more and boy, I'm useless, right? That kind of thinking is often a part of depression as well. Decreased concentration. And this is important, especially when we talk about it as a condition coexisting with ADHD, because depression on its own can have decreased concentration, right?
Right.
And we all know that with ADHD, you have decreased concentration. So clearly now we're getting into the overlap that I think you and I were going to talk about. So people with just pure depression without ADHD can have decreased concentration. And then the
It,
last possible symptom is probably the most serious, which is that people who are depressed often think about hurting themselves, right? They can think about death, they can think about suicide, they can think about, ending their life. And obviously that's something that alarms all of us when people get to that point of their depression. So the idea is that you don't have to have all of these, Andre, but at least five of these symptoms.
right.
But here's the other part that's important when in making a diagnosis of depression. We're all allowed to feel sad. Somebody important to us dies or passes away, or life isn't going well, or we've lost some money. We all feel a bit sad. That doesn't make a diagnosis of depression. You could have these symptoms, but one of the critical parts is it has to cause a significant impact or impairment in your functioning, whether it's your functioning in social settings, in work, in your family settings. So it has to interfere with your day-to-day functioning. And that's a key part of this. There's some other sort of diagnostic criteria which may not be as relevant for our listeners, but those are sort of the main symptoms that we're looking for in the criteria to make a diagnosis of depression.
So, a few things I heard there. So, any mental health condition, if it's going to be diagnosed and require treatment, has to have a daily impairment in your functioning day to day. I think that's a key difference.
That's exactly it. And certainly in a big part of your day or big or certain settings in your life. Yeah.
Right. And when you mentioned about decreased concentration with depression, is there a subtle difference between our inattentive or lack of focus tendencies with ADHD versus decreased concentration? Like I have a sense there's a slight difference there.
There is, but it's not an easy one to sort of nuance out always, Andre.
Right.
So when we're talking about the decreased concentration with depression, it often people will say they have difficulty completing tasks. They don't have attention on things that they're wanting to have attention on. Their concentration is down. Their memory is not great. And as we talked about, they can have sleep problems. Now, all of those fit quite nicely with ADHD. But what you don't get with depression that you can get with ADHD is some of those hyperactive components, right?
Right.
People that are depressed don't get fidgety, they don't get hyperactive, they don't get impulsive, right? They, depending on the kind of depression, they probably don't have mood swings and they're not super talkative, right? So a lot of those elements you won't see with depression, but you will see with someone who has ADHD and particularly the hyperactive symptoms around ADHD.
Okay, so since you've kind of introed into the next question. So how does depression present with people with ADHD? And does that make it more difficult to diagnose or treat? Let's start with the
And
first question. I think I just rhymed off a lot of them. Sorry about that. That was my
yeah.
impulsivity. How does it present differently or depression present itself with ADHD?
So I often, when we're teaching health practitioners this and telling people in the community this, we say this is why we do the work that we do at the Adult ADHD Center, because this is what makes adults with ADHD a lot more challenging, in my opinion, than kids with ADHD. Because adults with ADHD will have these coexisting conditions, whereas kids with ADHD will often have just pure ADHD without the depression or other coexisting conditions.
Right.
So when we have an adult with ADHD and depression, there are several ways to think of it. One is that those two things could be entirely independent, which means that people are allowed to have ADHD and depression that aren't related,
Right.
right? They have depression and ADHD, and one didn't cause the other one, and one isn't affecting the other one. So that's one sort of concept. The other concept is that one did lead to the other. And if you think about it, even from a simple perspective, people with ADHD have gone their whole lives. Things haven't gone well for them. Maybe they're in a career that didn't work out. Their relationships have been struggling. Their self-esteem, self-confidence can be beaten up. So how could they not be depressed or sad, right? So a lot of times ADHD that goes undiagnosed and untreated can actually lead to people getting depressed. So that's
Right.
ADHD causing depression. Now, if we look at the other way, one of the symptoms, and I rattled it off there, was people that are significantly depressed have decreased concentration because they're sad all the time. So if you think about people who are depressed, how could it not affect your concentration and focus?
Yeah.
So people that are depressed can actually, whether or not they have ADHD separately, can certainly make that ADHD worse just by untreated depression, right?
Right.
So one can lead to the other, or they can be entirely independent. The important thing, and a lot of times people like myself and psychologists and counselors will, go through an exercise where they try to figure out which one came first, a bit of the chicken or egg thing, right? But at the end of the day, we have our patient or client in front of us who has both. And whether which one came first is really just an academic and maybe curiosity. But at the end of the day, we have to help our patient or client treat both things because they have both inside the tent right now, under the tent right now.
Great
And so,
analogy.
yeah, and so it doesn't really matter which one came first. I've got both now, and we need to deal with both. We can't ignore one.
Right. Yeah, and a lot of those symptoms are so in some of the depression symptoms are ADHD symptoms and vice versa. Is it fair to say if someone without ADHD has depression who's showing some ADHD type symptoms, once the depression's been, I don't want to use the term cured or worked with, they've got their depression managed effectively, those symptoms will disappear. While with ADHD, they stick around.
Exactly. And that's so when we're seeing people at our adult ADHD center, that's exactly what happens. People will say, my doctor put me on all these antidepressants when I was in my teens and my young adult life. The depression sometimes got better, but a lot of times it didn't. But I didn't feel better. And that's because the underlying problem, the ADHD, was never looked at, was never addressed. But if you
Ah,
have, right? And so if the underlying problem wasn't addressed, of course the depression is not going to get better because the untreated, undiagnosed ADHD keeps feeding that depression and making it worse, right? And so a
yeah,
lot of times people come to us and they've been on all sorts of antidepressants and they'll say, things have never worked for me. It's because you didn't treat the root cause, right?
yeah. A weird analogy just popped in my head. Is I keep saying that my car can't stay straight on the road, so the mechanic keeps fixing the tire pressures and
Yeah.
adjusting those, but it's actually the alignment that's off.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's important to figure out. And so we get people who've been frustrated because the one wasn't treated. But to your point, there's another aspect of your question that I think is really important to note. If you have both things, how we manage it is that we treat whichever one is worse first. So if
Right.
somebody has ADHD and a coexisting depression, and they say the depression is a lot worse, we treat the depression first. And using your example, if the depression gets better or goes into what we call remission, the mood is under control. That, of course, is going to help the attention and focus. But if after the mood is better, the concentration, focus problems are still there, then we treat the ADHD afterwards. So don't ignore the ADHD. Now, if it's the other way, if the ADHD is worse, the depression's there, but the ADHD is clearly the worst thing for the person. We treat the ADHD first, and improving the ADHD, if you can think about their functioning is going to improve and their concentration focus is going to get better, the hyperactivity,
Right.
impulsivity is going to get better. How is that not going to also improve their mood? Right? Of course, their mood's going to also get better. But if you treat their ADHD and the ADHD is, let's say for argument's sake, is optimized, the ADHD gets to a state where it's under fairly good management and the mood problem is still there, well, you can still treat the mood problem afterwards. So
Right.
when we have ADHD and a coexisting depression, the general guideline is treat whichever one is worse first, and then if you need to treat the other one that's left over, treat it afterwards. But there's nothing to say they both can't be treated. It's just a matter of which one do you treat first.
Yeah, and whichever is more severe makes a lot of sense to me on that. Um, so on my podcast, I had Chuck Engelfeld, who came and talked about his personal experience with severe depression and wanting to sell his company and not caring anymore and not having the energy and just staying in bed all the time. And the one thing that really hit me on that conversation was the mood chooses you. You don't choose the mood in depression.
Oh, that's a great statement.
And when he said that, a few of the things that I've read and I heard at some conferences kind of clicked into me together. And I started realizing people are calling me depressive. Not, I've experienced severe depression where when Chuck was talking about, I didn't want to get in my bed. I actually wanted to sell a company and just say screw it and go into receivership. I didn't care anymore, and it scared the crap out of me. Um, but I'm always been accused of being depressed or depressive, and I find those are more mood related, depressive moods. I kind of call it, and I could always relate it back to a trigger because someone told me that a lot of these types of things are in ADHD. 9 times out of 10, they're triggered. Your emotions, your dysregulation, and I found these depressive mood swings. I could always relate back to a trigger with someone, with a person or not. Does that make sense to you that ADHD might be more a depressive mood condition that is what's triggered? You can get into these moods and in and out.
That's that's an interesting sort of thinking around that. It can be, and certainly people will say, "This is what happened," and because of that, now I'm feeling this way. My mood's down,
Yeah,
and so forth. But there are people, Andre, that don't have that ability to identify that significant event or that trigger, as you call it, and it just randomly happens. So
right.
I think what you're saying is right for a lot of people, and they can link it back to something that happened. But we shouldn't also discount people who just wake up with it. And then they can't say, well, my life is actually, I think, going okay. And there's one of two things there, Andre. One is that maybe there really isn't a trigger or an inciting event, or it's there and it's subconscious. It's there,
Yeah,
but they don't see it, right?
I agree
It's
completely.
yeah, it's
Yeah.
there and in the back of their mind, and they can't identify it despite they're intensely, going through therapy and trying to figure out why did I wake up this way? And it could be so buried in their subconscious that there is a trigger, but they just can't identify it.
Yeah, and I think that's the most frustrating part for most people is not identifying it or getting clarity or understanding why we're into these moods.
Yeah. And so
Okay.
people will say, I don't know why I'm feeling down. I've got a great partner, my family life is great, work is going fine. I'm not sure. Why do I feel this way? And when you go back to the biological basis for this condition, depression now, and we know about many times you and I have talked about ADHD and how it's a problem with dopamine and norepinephrine, but
Mhm.
we know that depression is also a problem with neurotransmitters, right?
Right.
Specifically, serotonin has received a lot of research, but we know dopamine is affecting mood. We know norepinephrine affects mood. So similarly, when we have PET scans with people with ADHD brains, we can also identify people who are depressed and recognize, for example, their serotonin levels are low. So when you get into that aspect, then you start thinking, yes, there is an environmental life event component, but then there's people who are just low in serotonin, right?
Right.
And so you don't need that inciting event or that trigger. It could just happen.
So it doesn't matter neurotypical or neurodivergent. It's still a serotonin condition for depression.
Well,
It's
serotonin is, and
serotonin.
there are multiple neurotransmitters that we think are affected. Serotonin is the one that we
Mhm.
talk about often. But I think what's important to note is that it can coexist with other health conditions. Nobody's sort of immune or can get vaccinated against it.
Yeah.
And it's fairly common. I mean, depression and anxiety, for that matter, are very common in the general population, whether you have ADHD or not, right? So having ADHD does not vaccinate you, make you immune, and protect you against getting other mental health conditions, unfortunately.
Right. And my point was that just because we have ADHD doesn't mean we're more prone. It sounded to me that everyone it's a neurobiological thing, depression.
So yeah, so but having said that, Andre, we know that people whose ADHD is not managed and not treated are at higher risk for being depressed.
I agree with that completely, but that's an environmental situation
Right.
causing, like you said, the ADHD could be causing the depression because of the untreated ADHD, and then the environment you're in causing you this depression. I know, like a lot of, like for me, I was very anxious, high anxiety when I was a kid because of I was different and trying to fit in. And then with Chuck's example, or I got a couple friends there, yeah, they got the. I think no, I'm going to use my example. I was definitely in a situation where I was resisted because of my ADHD that caused me with this depression. So I just want to make it clear from what I'm understanding is, you know, the ADHD, I think for a lot of, maybe it's an unfair statement, but just based on my ignorance or my lack of medical exposure, but ADHD to me causes a lot of the times the depression because of the environment of the situations within. It has to do more of a societal issue than medical. I don't know if that's a
Yeah.
fair statement.
Yeah, I agree. I think the environment and what's going on in your life will certainly impact that. But if I could flip it, Andre, just for a moment
Yep.
into something positive, which is that we've looked at studies now, and there's one that comes to mind. It was almost 40,000 people. It was about 38,000 people, and they studied them for 38 years. And what they found was that if you took the person with ADHD and you treated their ADHD, they had 20% fewer occurrences of depression than if you didn't treat them,
Yeah.
right? And so what that's saying to me is it's exactly what you had said earlier. If you can improve the ADHD and your life dysfunction isn't going on, you can actually reduce the likelihood that the person with ADHD is going to have the coexisting depression.
Right. So yeah, that's awesome. That makes a lot of sense to me. Um, so I'm a little, is there a difference between clinical depression and ADHD depression, or is it depression with the ADHD?
I think for our and I always have to look at it as what our sort of diagnostic criteria are. We treat them as that the depression is depression. You can have depression that coexists with ADHD, but the type of depression that ADHD people get versus the depression that people without ADHD get, we haven't been able to very clearly say that those are different.
So is it fair to say that ADHD depression is actually simply depression, either it occurs with the ADHD or separately?
Exactly. Yeah.
Wow. Um, thank you so much. Like, there's a few things I did not know. One, decreased concentration is one of the symptoms of clinical depression, which I can start seeing that where it really fogs the line between the inattentive part. Um, and I think the biggest takeaway here is that, treating the worst condition first is the best course of action, then work on the least severe. And either could be both combined, or the ADHD first, or the depression first, or at the same time is depression can be caused because of your ADHD, untreated ADHD, depending on your environment, depending on your life conditions, and it really happens to anyone, and anyone of any neurotype or any brain makeup, for lack of better words. So, the question I have for you, the listener, is: have you had episodes of depression, and have you had and looked for help? Because the one thing I've really learned in my journey in the last 5-6 years now is the best decision I ever made was not searching for my ADHD diagnosis, was actually to search to help for my mental health issue at the time, which was pretty much borderline personality at the time. So that was the best decision I ever made. And the one thing I have to tell you, Dr. Gurdeep, is what you're doing with the Adult ADHD Center. I've got to thank you in front of everyone here, because what you're doing with your services right now, bringing this service to adults all across North America, Canada at least, maybe North America, I'm not too sure, has been required for a long time. And I'd like to give us a little, what is the Adult ADHD Center, and why are you doing this?
So I started out as a family physician, and my area of medicine has always been people with visible and invisible disabilities. And so 6 years ago, we started to understand that adults with ADHD were struggling. Kids with ADHD could go to their pediatrician and other school resources, but adults didn't have that same access to treatment and to diagnosis. So we set up a center, not realizing what we had uncovered. We were just at the tip of the iceberg, meaning that so many adults were not being diagnosed and not treated. So we're providing access to diagnosis, and then starting a treatment journey in every province and every territory in Canada, so people can get the help they want, so they can live their best life, right? They've gone long enough leading a life that they didn't choose and not reaching the goals that they wanted to achieve. And so that's really, it's one patient at a time, but we know that we get up in the morning knowing that we're going to have a big impact in people's lives.
Yeah, and I thank you for that, because 5-6 years ago there was nothing out there for me like that, and it was tough to get the help that I ended up getting. So thank you very much, and to you, the listener, thanks again for listening. We'll talk to you soon.